3 days before the hanging, a stranger rode into Silverpeak with blood on his boots and a photograph faded by desert sun. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a debt to be paid. The town had made its choice long ago. Now the debt collector had come. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The town of Silverpeak sat like a disease on the edge of the Mojave, a festering sore of greed and compromise that had learned to call itself civilization. Its buildings leaned against each other like drunks, their wooden frames warped by decades of unforgiving heat. The main street was awash of dust and broken dreams, littered with the remnants of prospectors' failed ventures and saloon keepers' shattered bottles. 3 saloons stood within spitting distance of each other, each one promising a different flavor of oblivion, but delivering the same hollow ache. The stranger rode in around midday, when the sun was at its cruelest, that time when everything cast sharp, unforgiving shadows, and the heat shimmered like the desert itself was questioning whether it should bother breathing. His horse was a testament to hard miles, ribs showing beneath dusty hide, legs stained dark from creek crossings and blood trails. The animal moved with the determined exhaustion of something that knew better than to question its purpose. The rider sat loose in the saddle, his body synchronized with the horse's motion in the way only men who spent their lives in pursuit of vengeance ever managed. He wore a duster that had seen better decades, its original color lost to sun and wear, and a hat pulled low enough that his face existed mostly in shadow. Behind him, the desert stretched unbroken to the horizon, not a tree or a rock formation to mark its monotony, just emptiness and sky, just the kind of landscape that swallowed men whole if they lingered too long in it. As the stranger guided his horse toward the saloon called the Rattlesnake's Tongue, the few people on the street took notice. In towns like Silverpeak, strangers were either money or trouble, and this man's worn leather suggested the latter. An old prospector, squinting from a bench outside the assay office, studied him with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of drifter the frontier could produce. A woman in a faded dress stood in the doorway of the mercantile, her arms crossed tight, watching the stranger with the wariness of someone who'd learned to anticipate violence before it announced itself. The stranger dismounted with deliberate slowness, each movement economical and purposeful. He was a man in his mid-40s, lean in the way hardship produces leanness rather than any intentional discipline. His face, when the shadow of his hat brim finally revealed it, was weathered beyond his years, scarred by sun, work, and something deeper that didn't have a name. His eyes were pale gray, the color of old metal or predatory birds. They moved constantly, cataloging every detail of the town, every window, every corner where a threat might hide. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers curled with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to draw iron without conscious thought. "You lost, friend." The voice came from the porch of the Rattlesnake's Tongue, where a man in a sweat-stained vest stood watching the stranger with the lazy interest of someone confident in their dominance. His name was Herrick Soames, and he was the closest thing Silverpeak had to law, though the badge pinned to his shirt looked like it had been stolen from a corpse and never properly washed. We don't usually see drifters wandering in from the desert alone these days. The stranger tied his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care, looping the reins around worn wood polished by decades of hard use. He didn't look at Herrick yet. Instead, he reached into his shirt and withdrew a photograph, its edges curled and spotted with age. The sun had bleached most of the detail from it, but what remained was clear enough. A young woman in a white wedding dress, her face radiant with the kind of hope that only exists before the world teaches you what compromise means. "I'm looking for information," the stranger said, his voice rough as gravel. He turned the photograph so Herrick could see it clearly. About a woman who was in this town 12 years ago. Herrick's relaxed posture tightened immediately. Something in his face shifted. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or the sudden awareness that the universe had just sent him something he wasn't prepared to receive. He descended the saloon's 3 steps slowly, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip, but not quite reaching it. His eyes fixed on the photograph with the intensity of a man staring at a ghost. "Don't know her," Herrick said, but the hesitation in his voice contradicted every word. The stranger returned the photograph to his shirt and stepped closer, moving with the inexorable patience of a man who'd spent years tracking prey. Her name was Catherine Mercer. She was married to a rancher named Travis Mercer. They had land north of here, in the Box Canyon past Miller's Spring. As the stranger spoke, more people drifted out of buildings. The assay office door opened. A banker emerged from the Silverpeak Trust Company across the street. By the time the stranger finished speaking Catherine's name, at least a dozen pairs of eyes had focused on him with the kind of attention usually reserved for executions or natural disasters. "I don't know nothing about no Mercer woman," Herrick said, but his voice had taken on an edge of panic. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop asking questions that don't concern you." The stranger's pale eyes locked onto Herrick's with the force of a brand applied to skin. "It concerns me," he said quietly, "because Catherine Mercer was my sister." The words landed like a rifle shot, silencing the street completely. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. The stranger's presence changed then, shifted into something sharper and more dangerous. It was the quality of a man who'd spent 12 years carrying grief like a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment when he could finally fire. "She came here," the stranger continued, his voice steady but carrying layers of controlled rage beneath. "She and Travis had money from selling their property back east. They were looking to build something, start fresh, but something happened to her. Within 3 months of arriving in Silverpeak, she was gone, dead, and nobody ever explained why." Herrick's hand finally closed around his revolver hilt, but he didn't draw. "You're making accusations that could get you killed, stranger." "My name is Samuel Mercer," the stranger said, his name landing on the street like a curse. "And I'm not making accusations. I'm making statements. I'm telling you that I know what happened. I know who was involved. And I know that for 12 years, the people of this town have been living comfortably with murder." The street erupted into chaos. Not violent chaos, not yet, but the kind of panic movement that comes when people realize their secrets have finally found a voice. Someone bolted from the crowd toward the bank building. Another man ran down a side street, moving with the desperation of someone trying to outrun his past. Herrick's revolver was fully drawn now. The barrel pointed at Samuel's chest, but his hand trembled slightly. "I'm going to give you one chance to ride out of here," Herrick said, his voice thin and reedy. "Just climb back on that horse and disappear into the desert. Nobody needs to know you were ever here." Samuel smiled then, a terrible expression devoid of humor. 12 years of silence. 12 years of letting the murderers sleep easy. "No, Herrick, I'm not riding anywhere. I'm going to stay right here in Silverpeak until every person involved in Catherine's death understands what it means to pay." He turned away from Herrick, walking toward the Rattlesnake's Tongue's entrance with the fearless stride of a man who'd already made peace with his own death. Behind him, he heard Herrick cock the revolver's hammer, but Samuel didn't look back. Men like Herrick Soames fired their weapons out of fear, not conviction, and fear made them clumsy. The bullet missed, tearing through the wooden doorframe instead. By the time Herrick fired again, Samuel had vanished into the saloon's dark interior, and the desert wind was already carrying the echo of the gunshots away toward the mountains. Inside the Rattlesnake's Tongue, the darkness smelled like stale whiskey and spilled blood, the permanent sense of frontier establishments that had seen too much violence and not enough redemption. Samuel stood motionless, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, while his ears tracked the sounds of Herrick bursting through the door behind him, revolver raised. But Samuel was already moving, slipping between the saloon's heavy wooden tables with practiced ease, putting distance and obstacles between himself and the lawman. The saloon keeper, a rotund man with jowls that hung like hawks, crouched behind his bar, sensible enough to understand that the best response to gunplay was complete invisibility. The handful of drinkers who'd been nursing cheap whiskey moments earlier had already vacated or hidden themselves, knowing the signs of violence like animals know the approach of a storm. Samuel made it to the back exit, just as Herrick fired twice more, the bullets passing close enough that Samuel felt the displacement of air, the angry passage of lead cutting through space with intent to kill. He kicked through the rear door and found himself in the alley that ran behind the saloon row, a narrow canyon of brick and which shadowed by the high walls on either side. Behind him, he heard Herrick emerge from the saloon, heard the lawman's boots scraping against dirt, heard the heavy breathing of a man running on fear and adrenaline rather than true conviction. Samuel didn't run. Running was surrender, and Samuel had surrendered nothing in 12 years. Instead, he positioned himself behind a large wooden crate and waited, every muscle tense with predatory readiness. Herrick rounded the corner, his revolver extended, his eyes wild with panic. He fired without aiming, 3 shots that went wide, wasting ammunition that suddenly felt precious. It was in that moment of vulnerability, that instant when Herrick's hands shook as he fumbled to reload, that Samuel moved. He emerged from behind the crate, like a spirit materializing from shadow, crossing the alley in 4 long strides that ate distance faster than Herrick's mind could register the threat. Samuel's forearm came up in a perfect arc, catching Herrick's gun hand and driving it upward, just as the lawman fired again, the bullet whistling into the cloudless sky above. Samuel's other hand came open-palmed, striking Herrick's chest with enough force to lift the lawman off his feet and slam him backward into the brick wall behind him. Herrick gasped, the wind driven from his lungs, stars exploding in his vision. He tried to raise his revolver again, but Samuel's left hand clamped around his wrist with bone-crushing pressure, fingers digging into the sensitive nerves that ran through the joint until Herrick's grip went slack and the weapon clattered to the dirt. Samuel leaned close, his pale eyes burning with the intensity of 12 years' accumulated rage. "Where is she buried?" he asked quietly, his voice more terrifying than any shout could ever be. "My sister. Where did you put her body?" Herrick tried to speak, but the pressure on his wrist prevented coherent sound. His eyes watered with pain, and his face went purple from lack of breath and the force of Samuel's attack. "Talk," Samuel commanded, releasing just enough pressure to allow speech. Out past the old mining claims," Herrick gasped, his words fragmented by pain. "In a dry wash. They put her there to hide." Samuel's jaw clenched. 12 years. 12 years, and his sister had been lying in an unmarked grave, in a dry wash like she was nothing, like she was garbage to be discarded rather than a human being who deserved better. He thought about the wedding photograph, about Catherine's radiant face as she'd prepared to step into her new life. He thought about the dreams she'd shared with him before she left Kentucky for what she believed would be a grand adventure in the West. Who killed her? Samuel pressed, driving his forearm upward slightly to emphasize the question. "Travis, it was Travis," Herrick wheezed. He found out she was hiding money from him, money for herself. He thought she was planning to leave. He beat her, and she fell, and he thought she was dead when he found her still breathing. He hired men to finish what he started. Samuel released Herrick, and the lawman collapsed to his knees, coughing and gasping, his right arm hanging useless at his side. Samuel stood over him, breathing heavily, every muscle in his body screaming for violence. 12 years of patience, of tracking, of building the case piece by piece, and now he knew with certainty that his sister's own husband had orchestrated her death out of greed and wounded pride. "Where is he?" Samuel asked, his voice hollow and dark. "Travis, where is he now?" Herrick looked up at him with eyes that had lost all their confidence, all their dominance. "He's the banker," Herrick said, pointing a trembling finger toward the bank building visible through the alley's opposite end. He took the name Edward Clifton, changed everything about himself, lives in the big house up on the hill, married to a woman from back east, has children, acts like he's respectable. Samuel turned away without another word, leaving Herrick alone in the alley, injured and defeated. As he emerged from the narrow canyon between buildings, he found the main street in chaos. Herrick's shots had drawn attention, and people were clustered in doorways and on porches, watching with the nervous intensity of those about to witness something they couldn't take back. The photographs Samuel had shown Herrick circulated through the crowd now, passed from hand to hand, and recognition flickered across several faces. People who'd been in town 12 years ago, who remembered Catherine, who'd known her briefly before she vanished. An old woman, her face creased with the map of a long and difficult life, stepped forward from the crowd. She gripped Samuel's arm with surprising strength. "You're her brother," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "I knew Catherine. She was kind to me when nobody else was. She gave me money when my husband was sick." And then, the woman's voice trailed off, tears gathering in her eyes. And then she was just gone, and everyone stopped talking about her like she'd never existed. Samuel placed his hand over the woman's weathered fingers. "My name is Samuel Mercer, and I'm going to make sure she's remembered." The woman squeezed his arm tighter. "Edward Clifton, the banker. That devil deserves everything that's coming to him." The Clifton residence occupied the highest point in Silverpeak, a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from the wealthy districts of Boston or Philadelphia rather than constructed in the harsh environment of the desert. Its architectural pretension screamed of old money trying desperately to escape its origins, of wealth that believed it could purchase respectability and permanence when it couldn't purchase either. Samuel approached the house as the sun was descending toward the western horizon, that golden hour when shadows grew long and the air finally began to cool. He moved through the town with deliberate visibility, letting people see him, wanting his presence known. Each step was a bell ringing, and Silverpeak was listening. The front door opened before Samuel even reached it, and Edward Clifton emerged onto the porch. He was a thin man, all sharp angles and calculating eyes, with silver threading through dark hair that had probably been black before guilt and wealth combined to age him prematurely. He carried a rifle, though loosely, as though it was more a prop in his performance of respectability than a genuine threat. "You're not welcome here," Clifton said, his voice cultured and measured, the voice of a man who'd invested considerable effort in erasing any traces of his original accent and manner. "I don't know who you are, but I know what you want. And I'm here to tell you that the past is dead, just like the woman you're obsessing over." Samuel stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at the man who'd murdered his sister. 12 years of tracking had led here, to this single confrontation, and Samuel found that the rage he'd carried burning in his chest for more than a decade now felt strangely hollow. Not diminished, never diminished, but hollow in the way a weapon feels hollow when you finally understand what using it will cost you. "Her name was Catherine," Samuel said quietly. "Not the woman. Catherine Margaret Mercer. She was 26 years old. She liked to read poetry. She had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in summer. She volunteered at churches and orphanages. And when she looked at you, she saw possibility. She saw the man she thought you could become." Clifton's face twisted, but it wasn't with regret or shame. It was with rage, a furious anger that someone dared to remind him of his victim's humanity. "She was foolish," Clifton hissed. "She brought it on herself. A woman doesn't steal from her husband and expect mercy." "She stole to escape you," Samuel replied, his voice steady as stone. "She stole because she finally understood what you were, and when you discovered her plans, you couldn't handle the humiliation of a woman rejecting you, so you beat her to death." Behind Clifton, the front door opened wider, and a woman emerged, his current wife, probably, her face pale with shock and something that might have been dawning understanding. Behind her came several children, their eyes wide, watching this scene unfold with the terrible clarity children always bring to adult horrors. Clifton raised the rifle, pointing it at Samuel. "I should have buried you with her. I should have made sure nobody ever knew her name." "That's where you're wrong," Samuel said, beginning to ascend the porch steps slowly. "See, I was never going to kill you, Edward, because death would be mercy. Death would be escape. No, I wanted you to live in Silverpeak. knowing that every person in this town understands what you did. I wanted you to feel watched every moment, to know that the secret you buried a decade ago is now exhumed and displayed for all to see." Clifton fired, the bullet tearing through Samuel's left shoulder, spinning him partially around. But Samuel kept advancing, kept mounting the steps with inexorable purpose. Clifton fired again, this time the bullet catching Samuel high in the chest, and still he kept advancing, fueled by something stronger than blood or survival instinct. He was fueled by the need to make certain his sister's death meant something, that the man responsible understood the full weight of what he'd done. Samuel reached the porch, and Clifton tried to fire a third time, but Samuel closed the distance with a final lunge, driving the rifle upward as the gun exploded, the bullet passing through Clifton's own chin and exiting through the top of his skull in a spray of red and bone. Clifton fell, and Samuel fell with him, both men collapsing onto the expensive wooden porch of a house built on blood money and carefully maintained lies. Silverpeak assembled for the trial 3 days later, packing the small courthouse with every citizen who could fit and dozens more standing in the hallway and spilling out into the street. Samuel sat in the defendant's chair, his left arm in a sling, bandages visible at his neck where the bullet had passed, so close it burned rather than pierced. His shirt was stained with blood, mostly dried now, and his face had the hollow quality of a man who'd accomplished his objective, but found the victory hollow and unsatisfying. The judge was a man named Harlan Bates, probably in his 60s, with the hard-lined face of someone who'd seen enough human darkness to understand its infinite capacity for rationalization. He studied Samuel with something between contempt and reluctant respect, as though he couldn't quite decide which quality was more appropriate for a man who'd committed murder in the name of vengeance. "The evidence is clear," the prosecutor said, a smooth man from the territorial capital named Morrison, who clearly understood that this case was about establishing precedent rather than dispensing genuine justice. "The defendant, Samuel Mercer, shot and killed Edward Clifton. Multiple witnesses can attest that they heard the gunshots, and forensic evidence confirms that the defendant's bullets were the fatal ones." Samuel's attorney, a public defender appointed by the court, made a token defense based on insufficient evidence and circumstantial testimony, but everyone in the courtroom understood that such arguments were merely performance, words spoken to maintain the appearance of legal process rather than to influence the outcome. The real debate, the debate about whether vengeance could be dressed up as justice, whether a man had the right to execute judgment against his sister's murderer, that debate existed in the space between words, in the meaningful silences where the community considered its own complicity. On the third day of the trial, something unexpected happened. The old woman who'd spoken to Samuel in the street took the stand, and her testimony forced the full truth about Catherine's death into the open. She described conversations she'd had with Catherine before the young woman disappeared, conversations about Catherine's fear of her husband, her plans to escape, her last days alive as described by witnesses who'd seen her battered and broken, trying desperately to survive long enough to make good on her escape. Then came the other townspeople, the banker who'd helped Clifton establish his new identity, the sheriff who'd covered up the murder, the doctor who'd signed a death certificate he knew to be false. Witness after witness came forward with pieces of the conspiracy, painting a picture of a community that had chosen complicity over courage, that had allowed one of their own to be murdered and then forgotten simply because asking questions would have been inconvenient. By the time the trial concluded, the truth had transformed from an accusation into a confession spread across the sworn testimony of Silverpeak's most prominent citizens. The judge had no choice but to declare Samuel not guilty, on grounds of justifiable homicide in the pursuit of justice for a murder that the legal system had been too cowardly to prosecute. Samuel didn't stay in Silverpeak for the celebration that followed the trial's conclusion. Instead, he rode out to the dry wash where Herrick had indicated Catherine's body had been buried, taking the old woman with him and several townspeople who felt the need to bear witness to the exhumation and proper reburial. They found her beneath a cairn of rocks, preserved by the dry desert in a way that allowed identification despite the years. The old woman wept as they carefully exhumed the remains, and Samuel held himself together through sheer force of will, his shoulders rigid and his face a mask of control even as his soul shattered into fragments at the confirmation of his sister's death. They brought Catherine's remains back to Silverpeak and buried her properly, in the cemetery next to the church where her wedding ceremony had been planned 12 years earlier. A full funeral service was conducted, with the entire town in attendance, a community's attempted penance for the sin of looking away when it mattered most. Samuel stood at the grave's edge as the preacher spoke about resurrection and redemption, watching the wooden coffin they had constructed be lowered into the earth. The desert wind scattered the preacher's words, but Samuel heard them anyway, each phrase landing with the weight of inadequacy, of all the years he could never recover, all the life Catherine could never live. The old woman placed her hand on Samuel's shoulder. "She's at rest now," the woman said quietly, "and so can you be." Samuel turned to look at her, and for the first time since arriving in Silverpeak, his pale eyes were wet. "I'm not sure I know how to be at rest," he admitted. "For 12 years, this mission was my entire existence. Without it, I'm just a man standing in the desert with nothing left to carry." "Then carry something new," the woman suggested. "Stay. Help rebuild this town. Give some meaning to what happened here." Samuel considered the offer, looking around at the people of Silverpeak, people who'd been complicit in evil, but who were also capable of acknowledging that evil and attempting to compensate. The cemetery where his sister now rested, the church that had stood witness to her memory's rehabilitation, the possibility of redemption through service rather than vengeance. But when the sun set that night, Samuel rode out of Silverpeak, heading back into the desert from which he'd emerged. Some men were built for settlement, and others were built for the journey itself, and Samuel had learned through 12 years of pursuit that he belonged to the latter category. His legacy wouldn't be staying, but in leaving Silverpeak changed, leaving the truth exposed, leaving a community forced to reckon with its capacity for both evil and courage. The desert accepted Samuel back into its embrace as the sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that beauty seemed wasted on. He rode without purpose now, without the driving force of vengeance that had propelled him across the frontier for 12 years. His shoulder throbbed where Clifton's bullets had torn through flesh, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the emptiness that had settled into his chest. He'd stopped at a ridge overlooking Silverpeak, able to see the entire town spread out below him, its buildings reduced to shadows and its streets empty of the chaos that had defined the last several days. From this height, the town looked almost peaceful, almost like it had never been the site of murder and corruption and the slow cancellation of a young woman's life. From this height, even human evil looked small and temporary. A sound made Samuel turn in his saddle, his hand instinctively dropping toward his revolver. But what emerged from the shadows was not a threat. It was a young man, maybe 20, maybe younger, riding a horse that looked like it had carried him fast and far. The young man's face was familiar in a way that took Samuel a moment to place, and when recognition struck, Samuel felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. "You're my uncle," the young man said without preamble. "Catherine was my mother. Before my father murdered her and stole her life and her money, he made sure I was born first. Then he buried her and erased her and tried to bury me too, in a sense, by keeping the truth hidden." Samuel studied the young man, his sister's son, a child Catherine had birthed but never lived to watch grow. "How did you know to come here?" "The trial," the young man said. "I heard about it. People in the towns talked about nothing else. A man came west hunting for justice for his murdered sister. I put the pieces together, and I realized I needed to know my mother, even if that knowing only came through understanding the man who hunted her justice." They sat in silence for a long moment, uncle and nephew separated by 12 years and the weight of a family tragedy that had rewritten both of their lives. The sun continued its descent, painting them in gold and shadow. "What will you do?" Samuel asked finally. The young man looked out over Silverpeak, his face serious beyond his years. "I don't know yet, but I know I won't forget. That's what Catherine needs now, Not vengeance, but remembrance. Not rage, but the kind of quiet dedication to keeping her memory alive that transforms a person's entire life. Samuel nodded, understanding intuitively that his nephew had glimpsed something he'd been too close to the fire to see. Vengeance consumed, but remembrance could sustain. Rage burned hot and fast, but quiet dedication could warm through the longest and coldest nights. "Come with me," Samuel said. "Let me tell you about your mother. Everything I know about the person she was before circumstance and cruelty tried to erase her." Together, uncle and nephew descended from the ridge and rode back toward Silverpeak, not as avenging forces, but as bearers of memory, carrying Catherine's life in their hearts like a light that could push back against the darkness. The desert accepted them back into its embrace, and by morning, they had become part of the town's recovery process. Samuel working with the community to reconstruct itself, his nephew learning trades and skills, and the stories of his mother's kindness that the townspeople had kept alive despite everything that had worked to suppress them. Years would pass, and Silverpeak would eventually become known as a town that had reckoned with its sins and emerged changed by the reckoning. Samuel would take a role helping the community transform, and his nephew would eventually establish a school dedicated to preserving the stories of those lost to violence and injustice. But in this moment, watching the sun set over the desert that had carried him so far, Samuel finally understood what true justice meant. Not the swift punishment of vengeance, but the slow, patient work of remembrance and restoration, of building something meaningful from the ashes of what had been lost. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.